Toronto in the summer of 1974 was alive with change. The city's immigrant communities were growing rapidly. Jobs were plentiful in factories and service industries, and the nightlife was thriving with music, dance, and cultural mixing. To outsiders, Toronto appeared safe, modern, and full of opportunity. But beneath this polished surface, shadows lingered. Shadows of unresolved disappearances, uninvestigated murders, and marginalized victims whose stories too often slipped through the cracks. One of those stories is that of Dianna Singh, a young mother who came to Canada from Ghana in search of a better life, only to meet a violent and tragic end. Nearly 50 years later, her murder remains unsolved. Her name remembered mostly in fragments of cold cases. Diana's journey began in 1971 when she immigrated to Canada with her husband and their infant daughter. At just 21 years old, she was hopeful about what new life in Toronto could offer. Canada in the early 70s was actively encouraging immigration, especially from the Caribbean, and families like the Singhs were part of a new wave to reshape Toronto's identity. But the dream of a better life often clashed with harsh realities: low-paying jobs, cramped housing, and the strain of adapting to a new culture. By 1974, Diana's marriage had broken down. She was separated from her husband, raising her daughter largely on her own and living in a modest rooming house in Toronto. To make ends meet, she worked as a waitress at the Granite Club, a social spot where long hours and low wages were the norm. Yet, those who knew her described her as vibrant and resilient. Even in the middle of personal struggles, she carried herself with a sense of determination. What makes her story especially tragic is that she was also pregnant at the time of her death, carrying another child into a life that would never begin. On the night of August 14, 1974, Diana went to visit her boyfriend at Becker's convenience store near Jane Street and Woolner Avenue. She told him she might catch a ride with a man in a big car. That detail would later stick out to investigators because the timing coincided with the Toronto Transit Commission's 23-day strike. With bus and streetcars halted, thousands of commuters were stranded daily, forced to walk, carpool, or hitchhike. Hitchhiking was risky and tricky, but in that moment, it was one of the only ways that people could get around. For a young woman like Diana, with limited resources, it may have felt like her only option. That choice, made out of necessity, may have placed her directly in the path of her killer. After leaving the Beckers, Diana vanished. She would never return home to her daughter. On August 25, 1974, a security guard stumbled across a body in a wooded laneway in King Township, just east of Seneca College. It was Diana. She had been stabbed to death. Her pants and underwear were found discarded a few feet from her body, and it showed evidence of an assault. The autopsy confirmed not only the brutal stabbing, but also that she had been pregnant at the time. The discovery was grisly and shocking, but it also left investigators with few immediate leads. The laneway where she was found was secluded, making it difficult for investigators to canvass for witnesses. As 11 days passed, it became more difficult to find evidence and more valuable to find a witness. From the beginning, the investigation faltered. Police naturally questioned the two men closest to her estranged husband and her boyfriend. But neither man was ever officially cleared. Both provided stories that had holes in them, alibis that could not be fully confirmed, and timelines that raised eyebrows. Still, despite these inconsistencies, the case stalled. No charges were ever laid. Some suggest that the police didn't put the same energy into solving the case as they might have if Dianna had been a white middle-class woman. In the 1970s Toronto, bias often influenced which victims received resources and media attention. Dianna was a young immigrant mother of color, living in a rooming house, working in a bar. Her lifestyle may have led investigators to make assumptions rather than push for answers. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the trail went cold. Dianna's murder didn't just silence her, it silenced her family too. Over the years, her relatives, including her daughter, have chosen to remain largely private. They rarely give interviews or speak publicly about what happened. Some journalists who tried to reach out were told that the family preferred not to revisit the pain. But this silence had been debated. Some argue that without pushing forward, the family, avoiding media coverage, allowed the case to fade. Others say the silence is understandable. How do you reopen a wound that never healed? Imagine being 4 years old and losing your mother to murder, growing up with unanswered questions about why she never came home. That was the reality for Dianna's daughter. There was a parallel case. Yvonne LaRue was a young woman living in Montreal whose tragic end became a haunting chapter connected to the Dianna Singh case. Yvonne's murder, while separate on the surface, carried striking similarities to what would later be linked to Singh's disappearance. Detectives investigating LaRue's death were frustrated by the lack of leads. Despite exhaustive questions of neighbors and friends, no clear suspect ever emerged. The brutality of the crime raised concerns among Montreal police. The fact that both women were young, vulnerable, and ended up at the mercy of someone with a disturbing capacity for violence made investigators look for links between the two tragedies, even though no official confirmation was ever made. When we step back, Dianna's murder tells us something larger about the time in which it happened. The 70s were a turning point in how Toronto dealt with crime, especially violent crime against women. But cases involving women of color, immigrant women, or those with less social standing often received less attention. Media coverage was brief, resources limited, and community outrage muted. But cases involving women of color, immigrant women, or those with less social standing often received less attention. Media coverage was brief, resources limited, and community outrage muted. This inequality of response is something we still see today, but it was even more pronounced back then. Dianna's case may not have been ignored outright, but it certainly wasn't pursued with the relentless drive that might have led to answers. Despite the decades that have passed, Dianna's murder remains listed as open by the York Regional Police Cold Case Unit. Investigators continue to appeal for information, urging anyone who knows something, no matter how small, to come forward. Tips can be given directly to police by calling 1-866-876-5423, extension 7865, or anonymously through Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. What makes this case haunting isn't just the violence of Dianna's death, but the fact that her memory has almost faded. Outside of cold case lists and a handful of articles, her name is rarely spoken. But Dianna Singh was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman carrying dreams for her little girl and unborn child. She deserved to be remembered, to have her story told, and to one day receive justice. So tonight, as we reflect on her case, let's hold on to that memory. By keeping her story alive, we create space for truth to emerge. And maybe, just maybe, someone listening will remember something they've kept to themselves for too long and are now willing to speak about. The story of Dianna Singh leaves us with lessons that go far beyond one tragic case. First, it reminds us of the vulnerabilities faced by women in society, especially immigrant women, who are often forced into unsafe situations by poverty, lack of resources, or systemic neglect. Dianna likely didn't choose to hitchhike because she wanted to. She chose it because she had no other option. Second, it highlights how bias and silence can kill justice. Bias in how police prioritize cases, and silence from both the public and families, who sometimes, understandably, shy away from attention. When stories are not told, they are forgotten. And when they are forgotten, cases die. Finally, it teaches us the importance of memory. Justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Cold cases around the world have been solved decades later, often because someone, somewhere, refused to let the memory fade. By telling Dianna's story, we are keeping her voice alive, reminding the world that her life mattered and that every life deserves truth. That was the story of Dianna Singh, another cold case, another reminder of how fragile justice can be and how important it is to keep these stories alive, not just for the victims, but for all of us who believe in truth and accountability. I am the voice, and I will return with another case next week. Be safe as we continue to seek justice for the voiceless.